The first night he marked her, the iron sang. It sang as it left the coals, as it kissed the air, as it pressed its screaming letter into living skin. The sound traveled across the cane fields and into the house, settling into the beams like smoke. He told himself it was necessary, a lesson, a reminder of order. But when the smell reached him, burnt flesh and sweetness, something old and ungovernable opened its eye inside his chest. He did not sleep after that. The house would not allow it. The moment the brand touched her skin, it ceased to be an act of discipline and became something far more dangerous, though he did not recognize it at first. In the language of the plantation, branding was meant to erase individuality, to turn a living person into marked property, a thing defined by pain and ownership. Yet as the iron burned its shape into her, the power he believed he held began to twist inward, binding him as tightly as it bound her. He watched her endure the agony without screaming, her jaw clenched, breath shaking, eyes fixed not on him but somewhere beyond the yard, as if she were witnessing something he could not see. That silence unsettled him more than any cry could have, because it suggested a strength untouched by his authority. From that instant, the brand no longer represented control. It became a symbol of a connection forged through violence, one that could not be dismissed as routine cruelty. The plantation absorbed the act as if it were a wound of its own. The soil beneath their feet seemed to darken, the air thickened, and the house loomed closer, as though listening. He began to feel watched, not by the enslaved people who quickly learned to avert their eyes, but by the spaces between things, the shadows under the porch, the narrow hallways, the windows that reflected him back in fragments. The branded mark, meant to reduce her to less than human, instead magnified her presence in his mind. He found himself searching for her in crowds, listening for her footsteps, replaying the moment of the iron again and again, each memory tightening like a knot. In trying to assert dominance, he had crossed an invisible line. Ownership had turned into fixation, and fixation into something resembling dependence. He told himself he needed to keep her close to prevent unrest, to manage the consequences of what he had done. But beneath that reasoning lay a quieter truth. The act had hollowed him out. The authority he relied upon now felt brittle, easily shattered by a look from her scarred shoulder, or the calm way she met his gaze afterward. Whispers began to follow him, not spoken aloud, but carried in glances and silences, as though everyone sensed that the brand had marked him as well. What frightened him most was the realization that the pain he inflicted had not ended with her wound. It had spread outward, seeping into the walls of the house and the rituals of daily life, transforming punishment into a private bond neither of them could escape, a bond born in fire and sealed in silence that followed him into every room and every sleepless night, where the echo of the iron still rang in his ears and refused to fade. The marriage announcement fell over the plantation like a sudden storm, one that broke without warning and left everyone standing in stunned silence. A master marrying a woman he had once branded violated every unspoken law that governed the place, unsettling both the enslaved and the free. To the outside world, he framed it as mercy, redemption, even love, but beneath those words lay panic and obsession. He believed that by binding her to him through vows instead of iron, he could rewrite the meaning of what he had done, transforming cruelty into destiny. The ceremony was small and rushed, conducted at dawn, as if daylight itself might refuse to witness it. She stood beside him with the same quiet composure she had shown during the branding, her expression unreadable, her presence commanding a stillness that unsettled everyone who watched. The social order fractured instantly. White neighbors whispered of madness and moral decay, their visits growing fewer, their letters colder. Overseers questioned his judgment in private, while in public they bowed their heads, unsure which rules still applied. Among the enslaved, fear mingled with something sharper and more dangerous: expectation. Some saw the marriage as proof that the world they endured was cracking, that the lines drawn in blood and law were not as permanent as they seemed. Others sensed a trap, understanding that such a union could provoke harsher punishment, more scrutiny, more suffering. The plantation became a place of waiting, as though everyone anticipated a reckoning they could feel but not yet name. Inside the house, the change was immediate. Rooms that once reflected his authority now felt foreign, claimed by a presence he could not command. She moved through the halls with measured steps, touching the walls as if recognizing them, as if the house had always known her. Servants avoided meeting either of their eyes, unsure which of them now held power. At night, he lay awake listening to the building settle and shift, convinced that it breathed differently with her inside it, as though it approved of the disruption. For him, the marriage deepened the conflict he had hoped to erase. He expected possession to bring peace, yet closeness only sharpened his unease. The scar he had tried to hide beneath silk haunted him, a reminder that vows could not undo fire. He watched her carefully, searching for gratitude, forgiveness, submission, but found none of it. Instead, there was patience, a steady confidence that suggested she understood something he did not. The union meant to restore order instead, exposed how fragile it had always been, turning his authority into a performance and his home into a stage where resentment, curiosity, and dread gathered silently, feeding on the knowledge that a boundary had been crossed and could never be restored after the marriage. The house began to behave as if it were no longer an object, but a witness that had decided to speak in its own slow language. At first, the changes were subtle, easy to dismiss, as the habits of an old structure settling into itself. Doors that had always stayed open now drifted shut. Floorboards groaned under invisible weight, not randomly, but in patterns that repeated night after night. He told himself these were coincidences, the natural sounds of timber and stone, yet he noticed how they intensified when she passed through certain rooms, how the walls seemed to lean inward, listening. The house that had once affirmed his authority now responded to her presence with an attention that felt intimate and unsettling. Sounds followed. Whispering drafts slid through corridors that should have been sealed, carrying fragments of breath and syllables too faint to grasp. Sometimes he woke convinced that voices were gathering beneath the floor, murmuring in a rhythm that echoed the fields at harvest time. When he searched, lantern raised, he found nothing but stillness and shadows that refused to settle. The silence afterward felt deliberate, as though the house had chosen to hide its secrets from him alone. Locked rooms began to trouble him most. Doors he did not remember closing resisted his touch, their handles cold and unyielding, as if the house itself decided who could enter. She noticed these changes but never commented on them. Instead, she moved through the space with a familiarity that unsettled him more than fear would have. She paused at thresholds, tilted her head as if listening for approval, then stepped forward when the air seemed to ease. It was as though the house recognized her as part of its memory, welcoming her into corners he had never truly occupied. Servants whispered that the walls felt warmer when she leaned against them, that the night noises softened when she slept. None of them would repeat these claims to his face, but he felt their certainty pressing in on him. As days passed, the house seemed to rearrange itself around his regret. Hallways felt longer, rooms smaller, mirrors reflected him at odd angles, fragmenting his image. He began to sense that the building remembered everything done within it. Every cry swallowed, every order given, every silence endured. With her inside its walls, those memories stirred, no longer content to remain buried. The plantation house had always been a symbol of control and permanence, but now it felt alive, responsive, aligned with a past he could not command. What frightened him most was the growing conviction that the house was no longer his, that it had chosen her as its voice, and that through creaks, shadows, and sealed doors, it was slowly reminding him that some structures are built to remember, not to forgive. Her influence did not arrive through command or confrontation, but through a quiet reshaping of the plantation's rhythms, subtle enough that no one could name the moment it began. She listened more than she spoke, and when she did speak, it was often to those he had never bothered to hear. In the kitchens on the edges of the fields, in the narrow hours before dawn, stories surfaced that had long been buried under fear and routine. Names of the dead were spoken aloud again. Places where bodies had been hidden were remembered with unsettling clarity. She did not ask for these truths. People offered them as if relieved to place their weight somewhere at last. The land itself seemed to respond, producing bones after heavy rains, collapsing old sheds to reveal stains that could not be scrubbed away. As her presence deepened, his authority thinned. Orders were followed more slowly, sometimes imperfectly, as though obedience had become optional. Overseers hesitated before enforcing punishment, glancing toward the house as if uncertain whose will mattered most. He felt this shift acutely, sensing power drain from him in small humiliations rather than open rebellion. She never challenged him directly, yet her calm certainty undermined every command he gave. When disputes arose, people looked to her instinctively, trusting her judgment over his rage. The scar he had given her became a silent credential, a mark that testified not to his dominance, but to his guilt. The truths she carried reached him indirectly, through rumors that slipped into his thoughts and refused to leave. He dreamed of the plantation as it once was, not the version he told visitors about, but the one soaked in suffering, its foundations laid with cruelty. In waking hours, he began to notice details he had trained himself to ignore. The way the fields seemed uneven, as though covering something. The way the river shifted its course near places no one visited. His mind circled these observations obsessively, unable to settle, as if he were being led toward a reckoning he could not escape. She grew steadier as he unraveled. Her voice, when it reached him, carried an assurance that bordered on prophecy, speaking of the land as if it remembered every footstep and would one day demand balance. He started to question his own perceptions, doubting whether the whispers he heard were memories, accusations, or inventions of a weakening mind. The plantation that once reflected his power now reflected his fear. Each revealed truth peeling away another layer of certainty, leaving him exposed in a place where the past had begun to rise, patient and insistent. Waiting to be fully seen, Regret no longer lived only in his thoughts, but moved through the house as a presence that refused to be named. It crept along corridors in the late hours, pressed against his chest when he tried to breathe, settled into chairs opposite him, as if waiting to be acknowledged. He began to understand that regret was not an emotion to be endured, but a force that demanded attention, shaping itself out of memory and consequence. Every room reminded him of a choice he could not reverse, every silence echoing with what might have been different had the iron never touched flesh. The marriage he once believed would redeem him now felt like a confession he was forced to repeat endlessly, each day exposing him further. Sleep abandoned him entirely. When it came in fragments, it carried visions that felt less like dreams than judgments. He saw her as she was before the branding, unmarked and distant. And then as she was after, scar glowing as if still hot. He woke convinced that the house itself had staged these images, arranging them carefully to ensure he understood the depth of his wrongdoing. In the daylight, the same understanding followed him relentlessly. The land he once ruled felt hostile, its paths narrowing, its trees leaning inward as though watching. Regret sharpened his awareness until every detail cut him, from the sound of her footsteps behind him to the way servants flinched at his approach. He tried to reclaim authority through force, issuing harsher commands, retreating into old habits, but the effort only exposed how hollow his power had become. The house resisted him openly now, doors locking without reason, windows rattling even in still air. He sensed that whatever held him, there was not punishing him out of malice, but necessity, as if the place itself required him to remain and witness the full weight of what he had done. Leaving became unthinkable. The road beyond the plantation felt unreal, like a story told to comfort children. She remained calm as his desperation grew. When she looked at him, there was no triumph in her eyes, only an understanding that bordered on sorrow. He realized then that regret was not something she imposed on him, but something born from his own actions, sustained by his refusal to fully confront them. The marriage, the house, the land, all formed a closed circle designed to hold him steady. While truth pressed in from every side, he understood too late that the bond created in fire could not be undone by vows or remorse, and that the place he called home existed not to shelter him, but to ensure he never escaped the knowledge of who he had been and what that had cost. A knowledge that tightened around him like a living thing, patient, unyielding, and eternal.